Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Very, very heartful welcome. My name is Dirk Wouters, and I'm the creator and the co-chair of the America Europe Fund at this university. And I can tell you, this is the only university in Belgium that has tried to positively respond to the new context in the transatlantic relations with a very concrete initiative, the America Europe Foundation at KU Leuven. And as part of this initiative, a new master program on transatlantic relations has been launched. It's now almost at the end of its second year. And I mention this because it allows me to also greet my own students here in this very large group of students. So take a look, I would say, take a look at the website, www.americaeuropefund.eu. You will find a lot of information, and we will complete in the coming days and weeks this information with the latest. I just came back from the United States, where for a couple of weeks I've tried to find American partners, new American partners for this America Europe Fund, and I think it was a successful visit and a lot of interest and a lot of concrete agreements with American universities and American think tanks and other organizations to have also on the other side a pillar of our foundation. So I would like to thank all the students today, the professors and the invited guests who have responded in great numbers to this invitation. And I recognize in particular our former Minister of Justice and still very active in our parliament, Koen Geens. Thank you so much for your time and to come to listen what promises to become a fascinating lecture by Gilles de Kerkhoven. He asked me to refer to him as my friend Gilles de Kerkhoven, which I'm happy to do. I want to say that a few things about his outstanding career. Gilles de Kerkhoven, for 14 years, I think, was the EU coordinator in the fight against terrorism. So the EU terrorism coordinator, which covered a couple of things. Well, the coordination, of course, and the overseeing of all the available instruments within the European Union that were useful in the fight against terrorism. He was also responsible for engaging with third countries in the fight against terrorism. And also he had to implement the strategy of the European Union in the fight against terrorism. Apart from this job, which was a hell of a job, I think, he did another hell of a job, which was as Director General at the Department of Justice and Home Affairs of the EU General Council Secretariat. And before that, I had the opportunity and the pleasure to work together with Gilles de Kerkhoven when he was Chief of Staff, in fact, of successive ministers, economy, justice, and defense in ministers in the Belgian government. So outstanding career. I'm not even mentioning the fact that he was Deputy Secretary General of the Convention, which drafted the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union. Gilles de Kerkhoven is still teaching European law at the Catholic University of Louvain, UCL, the Free University of Brussels, ULB. You're forgiven. We are very forgiving here at KU Leuven, and the College of Europe at Natolin, I understand, and has published a number of books. But if you really want to learn more about his publications and his work, I recommend the Liber Amicorum, that is still very recent, edited by Breuland, and I think it was 2 years ago, 2021, that this Liber Amicorum came out. I conclude by saying that he has a law degree at the Catholic University of Leuven. Was it 79? Was it not maybe the last year that you were you here or already at Leuven? On both sides. And also Gilles de Kerkhoven has a law degree of Master of Laws, an LLM, the famous LLM, at the Yale Law School. So, as the title indicates of his lecture today, Gilles de Kerckhove will cover the EU response to terrorist threat, also the function, of course, of the EU terrorist coordinator, and the current counterterrorism challenges, including the relations, with, of course, with the United States. We have agreed to reserve more or less half an hour for your questions, and we will finish at 1 p.m. at the latest. So, without further ado, Gilles de Kerckhove, Gilles, cher ami, may I invite you to the podium and deliver your lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I'm very moved, I'm very honored to be today, this morning, moved by the kind words. I'm moved to be here in Leuven because, as you said, I spent the 2 first years of my licence en droit here in Leuven. And is it the library, right? Yeah? It reminds me that my grandfather spent the whole First World War in the United States to raise money to rebuild this library. He was president of the House of Representatives and Minister of State. I'm moved and honored to have here the attendance of Koen Gees, with whom I worked a lot when he was Minister of Justice, someone who pushed a lot EU integration in the field of justice and home affairs, and I will come back to that. And Willy Bruggeman here in the first row, with whom I worked. He was, I think, in the first management team of Europol when they had to start from scratch. So, as Dirk said, I will touch upon three items. First, but it will be very short. What is the EU response to counterterrorism? Second, I will try to explain a bit the job that I've been doing for 14 years, which is a bit weird. And I will explain why I was not very much in favor of the job in the first place, but why I think it's an interesting innovation in terms of governance. And third, address 4 challenges. There are many more than these 4, but I think these are at least the 4 on which I was the most involved in when I left. So the EU response to counterterrorism. If you look at the history of integration in the field of security, terrorism has always been the common threat, the fil rouge. It started in a way after the attack at the Olympic Games in 1972, when Palestinian terrorists killed several Israeli athletes. And that led the Minister of Interior at the time to start the first sort of organization. They call it the Trevi Cooperation, asking the police to meet more regularly. Minister of Interior met more regularly as from that date. 4 years later, a French Air France flight was hijacked to Entebbe, and that led the then President of France, Giscard d'Estaing, to launch the idea to have a sort of European judicial space. 9/11, of course, was an occasion to do a major step towards integration. It led to the European arrest warrant. No time to develop what the European arrest warrant is, but in terms of loss of sovereignty in a way, or regain of sovereignty, it is similar to moving from national currency to the euro. It led to the definition of terrorism. Europe is the first entity in the world which was able to define terrorism in legal terms, which is pretty a challenge. 2004, the Madrid bombings, more than 200 people killed in Atocha, led to the creation of my position, led to the adoption of an EU strategy in counterterrorism, a comprehensive one. Then 2005, the London attack led to an important piece of legislation, I'll come back to that, allowing state to impose to service providers and telecom operators to keep the metadata, i.e. the data when you send a mail, you give a phone call, you are localized somewhere. This is not about substance, it's more the technical metadata on a communication. And then 2013, the start of a huge phenomenon, and I will come back to that, called the foreign terrorist fighters. More than 5,000 Europeans who left Europe to join Daesh and Al-Qaeda in Syria and Iraq. We had never seen that before. And then 2015, the attack against Charlie Hebdo, Bataclan then, and then Brussels, that led the European Union, the Commission to launch a new concept called the Security Union. In legal term, in institutional term, the real tipping point was the Treaty of Lisbon. The European Union only started working on security with the Treaty of Maastricht. But we have been doing that, as from Maastricht, through what we call the intergovernmental method, where most of the power are in the hands of the Council. The Parliament has not much power. The Commission had nearly no power on criminal justice and police, and the Court of Justice was completely put aside. It's only after Lisbon that member states have decided to use the committee method and to make internal security a shared competence between the European Union and the member states. So very important and quite impressive, because Maastricht enters into force in 1993 and Lisbon in 2009. So in 16 years, we, because I was involved and many people here, we managed to convince member states to accept to use the community method and accept that internal security be a shared competence. This being said, even after the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty, the Commission was a bit, not on the back foot, but a bit reluctant to be too active and too visible. I remember the then French Commissioner, Jacques Barrot, who had stopped a draft declaration, a communication more, prepared by DG Home on how to prevent people from getting radicalized. And it was a very good piece of paper. But he stopped that and was very disappointed. Member states were disappointed. So I went to see Barrot and I said, why are you stopping that? And he said, you know, it's not for the Commission, it's not for the EU. This is for member states. This is too sensitive. And if I do that, I will need an armored car and 2 bodyguards. I said, what is this mindset? The Treaty of Lisbon has now decided that it's a shared competence. When you look at the treaty, and I won't bother you with the treaty, if you read Title V of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, yes, we use the community method, but the substance of Title V, let's say it's pretty not very ambitious. It is still very much a mindset of intergovernmental cooperation. The agencies, Europol, Eurojust, are there to support member states prime responsible for internal security. And I invite you to read that. More than that, in the final rush of the negotiation of the Lisbon Treaty, the Brits asked to insert a small sentence in Article 4 of the Treaty on the European Union. And that was Tony Blair's blackmail. He said, if I don't get that, I will ask a referendum on the draft Lisbon Treaty. And we knew, because of the failure to adopt the Constitutional Treaty, that, of course, it will be a negative outcome. And so what was the sentence? The sentence was, while member states are the prime responsible for internal security, they are the solely responsible for national security. And I used to ask my students, what's the difference between internal security and national security? In the Anglo-Saxon world, national security is a cryptic way to mean intelligence. MI5, MI6, but not only the Brits, the French, the German, were extremely against any role for the European Union in the field of intelligence. I have no time to dwell on that. There is divergent opinion as to whether Article 4.2 is about competences or just indicate a wish of member states to keep it for themselves. Because I used to say myself, when I was in my previous position, national security is the solely responsibility of the member states, but I would say European security is probably the solely responsibility of the European Union. So that does not distribute competence, but it shows something. So in legal terms, but in political terms, the real tipping point happened after the Charlie Hebdo attack in January 2005, and of course has been amplified later after the attack in Paris, Bataclan, in Brussels, Zaventem, Malbec, and so forth. Heads of state and government, as they always do, met and decided to ask to the different formation of the council to do a lot more in terms of repression, a lot more in terms of prevention, preventing radicalization, and a lot more, as Dirk alluded to engage with third state, which are our first line of defense, and concentrate more to the neighborhood, from Morocco to Turkey, including the Western Balkans, because these are our first line of defense, first. And second, because all these countries need a lot of support. Their response to terrorism is led by the intelligence community. They don't care about judicial justice response. They don't invest in prevent at all. So it's a very, very one-sided, very problematic response to terrorism. And on top of it, as I said just at the outset, Juncker, the president of the Commission at the time, launched a new concept, which I like a lot, the security union. If you think of the monetary union, it has a lot of potential. And he appointed a commissioner, full-time commissioner in charge of security. Why? Because, and that's unfortunately, we've underlined a bit the same, the commissioner for home affairs is really completely overwhelmed by migration. So 60-70% of the time of a commissioner for home affairs is to deal with migration, asylum request, and not much time or energy to invest in security. And therefore, he appointed the last British commissioner, Julian King, as security commissioner. I won't go into the detail of what we've been doing during these 15 years. It is, in a way, impressive. We've been doing a lot in terms of repression, in terms of prevention, in terms of engage with third state. Prevention, we have, and that, I think, was a bright idea from the Commission, not to come with recipe. Because honestly, I spent 14 years reading thousands of pages on what are the triggers, what are the drivers of radicalization. Why is it that someone gets radicalized and falls into violence? And it's really very difficult. So what they did, they decided to connect all the field practitioners, prison staff, teachers, geeks, IT geeks to work on internet, psychologists, social workers, just to identify what works and what doesn't work. What are the best practices? And now this radicalization aware network connect more than 6,000 practitioners all over Europe. In terms of repression, while the then Commission had decided not to adopt a lot of legislation, because they know member states do not like the EU to adopt too many legislation, in this field, pushed by events, the Council and the Parliament adopted a quite impressive number of legislation. As I said, definition of terrorism, access to digital evidence, I will come back to that, firearms, access to passenger name record data, reduce chemical precursors which allow to build a bomb. I think we are now at the 6th money laundering directive, and on top of it, we'll adopt soon a regulation and set up a new agency. Protection of critical infrastructure. On cyber, we have several legislation, and so forth. On the operation side, as from the Bataclan, Europol and Eurojust have been involved in each and every investigation or prosecution in the field of terrorism. When Willy Bruggeman was at Europol, Europol had no access to CT file, living file, because the member states didn't trust Europol. They wanted to keep that for themselves. As from the Bataclan, it was systematic. Not just because the French were in love with Europol. It is just that they had so much data to handle, billions of data, telephone conversation and so on, that they needed the support of Europol with its big computers, with its very gifted analysts and so on. We invest a lot on borders. strangely enough, we were not checking Europeans when they were crossing the external borders. When an American comes back to the United States, he's checked, his ID is checked against all the database. But we were doing that only for third country nationals, not for Europeans. So we had to change that. It was pretty difficult. The Commission was pretty reluctant. They were afraid that we were putting Schengen in danger, but at the end, we have done that. We have changed completely our border agency called Frontex, which was not a security agency until then. So we have done a lot. And on the external side, I won't go into detail either. I have spent 14 years traveling in all these countries to design security partnership and mobilize EU money to build their capacity, to beef up their response. When I started, we had not a single euro spent on security in a third state, on CT. When I left, I think we were around €500 million, which is pretty significant, helping them on the whole chain, from intelligence restructuring up to prison, developing the prevent policies, promoting a judicial response, helping them to create new database, to connect the borders with Interpol and so on. So very impressive. So in a way, the message of my first point is, while the Commission was pretty shy at the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty, I think now they have realized that member states want the Commission and the Council to be a lot more active. And if you look at the Eurobarometer, during that time, probably no longer now, but at that time when people were asked, where do you want to see more Europe, they always put security on top. Above environment concern, above unemployment, that was the main concern. And the Commission understood that. And now I think we can say that the European Union is not the prime security provider, but it's a very credible and serious security player or security provider. That's my first point. The second point, just a word on the position that I have been in charge of for 14 years. As I said before, it was created after the Madrid terrorist attack. Heads of state and government had to say something. And that's the problem. When you have a huge attack of that scale, they need to come with something. And they said, we will appoint a terrorist czar. That's fine. I was, at the time, in tone, the only one against the creation of the post. You will find that a bit odd, but I thought it was probably a false good idea. Because the position was, it was positioned pretty high, decided by heads of state and government. But my point at the time was to say, how can you expect one person, he or she, with a very small team, because most likely the person would not get a huge directory general, would get a team of 5 or 6 experts, be in a position to tell ministers from different formations, Minister of Justice, Minister of Home Affairs, Minister of Finance, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Defense, to tell to 28 ministers what they had to do and try to coordinate at least 5 or 6 communities: the intelligence community, the law enforcement community, the prosecution, the Ministry of Finance, the military, and believe me, I've been doing that for 14 years, they speak differently, they have a different mindset, they have their own culture, and you have to adjust the way you speak to them, because and many of them don't like to work together. As I've heard very often, everyone is in favor of coordination. It was in the title of my job, but no one wants to be coordinated. And to think that a single person would tell the 28 security service, no, you come here and I will tell you what to do. On top of it, access to information. When I was sitting in the council and talking to the Minister of Interior, let's say I had to tell the French Minister of Interior, who has 140,000 police officers, 100,000 gendarmes, 10,000 guys in his security service, the DGSI, hundreds of préfets, bright brain in his ministry and a private office, and he has a small document with 4 pages of ideas. How can I, with 6 guys, tell him what to do? And he has the captures on the ground. So, that was the reason why I thought it was a false good idea. But this being said, the job had some interesting aspects. First, I was located in the Council Secretariat, but I was neither in the Commission nor in the Council. But the positive aspect was that I was in charge of one single issue, but looking at all aspects, internal, external, and all the policies, from culture, integration, foreign policy. And that's an asset, because in a way, the way we work in Brussels is a lot divided by silos, by different communities working among themselves. And so that gives you a sort of asset. The other one was the absence of any real boss. It was a bit strange. It's a position with no real boss, except that you have a management board. And a management board, that's the council formation. That's the 27, 28 ministers. As long as you get their trust and support, that works well. But you can lose that in 5 minutes. If you say something completely bizarre or that the member state does not like, if the German minister, after your intervention, say, what Gilles de Kerchove says is completely weird and we don't support that, you better try to find another job. So it's a sort of very strange position. I remember one MEP, one of the toughest one, which made my life very difficult in the European Parliament, from D66, Sophie Nutveld, a Dutch, very libertarian MEP. She said once, by the way, Mr. de Kerchove, on behalf of whom are you speaking? And that was a good idea, a good question, because I could not refer and ask member states to tell me exactly what I should say, because I would not have done anything. It's much too long, much too cumbersome. So in a way, I did my best to perform the following 5 functions. First, and that's obvious because it's in the title, coordinate. Coordinate these 5 or 6 communities that I've mentioned. The second one, identify the looming threats and offering response. Third, sometimes be brave enough to raise difficult issues. 4, try to keep counterterrorism pretty high on the agenda. Why is it so important? Because one of the problems with CT, counterterrorism, is the ups and downs. When you have a terrorist attack, Bataclan, Brussels, and so on, there is such an emotion that political leaders meet and take sometimes decisions which go a lot, sometimes a bit too far. They would not have decided that had they not been confronted with a major terrorist attack. But when there is nothing, there is not much interest. And so the risk is overdo or underdo. And so trying to have someone who keeps the file pretty high on the agenda, I think was something interesting. And finally, being the public face of counterterrorism, being in the media, which, by the way, I had not done before. It was quite a challenge for me. I don't have much time to illustrate this function, but I would like to give some example under these 3 before moving to my third chapter. Cooperation. The big challenge was to find a way to encourage the intelligence and security community to work more together and to work more with the police. The first step, bringing the security services, the Belgian Staatsveiligheid, the French DGSI, MI5, BFV in Germany, and make sure that they do work together a lot more was a big challenge. And I had to, honestly, for sometimes bully them a lot so that they accept, because that's not in the DNA of the security service. They like bilateral work, they like B-multi, but working with 27 or 28, honestly, is not in their DNA. A bit, let's be honest, and don't quote me on that, there is not full trust among the 28 security service. If I remember some concern of a large member state, they say, I will never, or at least for some time, share sensitive information with the Bulgarian because I know it will end up in Moscow. So that's something, but the problem is that for counterterrorism, it's not the same at all. And one of the problems I was faced with was that a lot of the security service had still a Cold War mindset, which is back, by the way, with the war in Ukraine. And they were behaving as if they were fighting the Russian and not a common enemy. The difference between the Cold War and the fight against terrorism is that when you try to identify a spy in your system, you have time and you have to be extremely secretive and share with very few. Only, as they say, those who need to know. But when you are fighting terrorism, you need to go very quickly, you don't have time, and you have to share with as many people as possible. So it's the need to share and not the need to know. And this change in mindset took some time. And after a while, and to be honest, that was my only tool, a lot the media. So after Bataclan or after Charlie Hebdo, I went into the French media, and I, in a way, bullied a lot the security service that they were not sharing enough. When the phenomenon of the foreign terrorist fighters in 2013 started, they even not had a common list of the Europeans who went to Iraq and Syria. That was insane, because they were still with this Cold War mindset. And so they moved, they create a common platform, and honestly, today, it's perfect. They share 100%. They don't have a Europol because they didn't decide. So the intelligence community, unlike the law enforcement community, did not go for an institution like Europol, but they create a common platform. They have a common database. They have a secure network. It's located in the Netherlands at the Security Service of the Netherlands, the AIVD, and they share 100%. They have 28 liaison officers working 24/7. It is excellent. The next challenge is to create a bridge between that community and this platform with what the law enforcement community has done by creating Europol. And that remains a challenge. Second example, so the foresight function, FTF. In January 2013, I was preparing a presentation to the Minister of Interior on the consequence of the Arab Spring on the security of Europe. And the night before, someone in my team, a very clever young woman, who is currently the head of the Belgian Security Service, the Staatsveiligheid, Francisca Bastien, came to my office and said, I talked to the Dutch, I talked to the Belgian, I have the feeling that something a bit bizarre, something a bit weird is happening. We see hundreds of young guys going to the Sham, Syria and Iraq, to join Daesh and Al-Qaeda. We have had that sort of foreign fighting in Bosnia-Herzegovina during the war in Yugoslavia. We have had that in Afghanistan. We have that a bit in Yemen, but not on that scale. It was several dozens. Here it was hundreds, if not more. 5,000, it ended up with 5,000. So the day after, when I presented my paper on the consequence of the Arab Spring, which, by the way, was much too optimistic, I said to the ministers, I said, I have the feeling that something bizarre is happening, and I think we should collectively look at it a lot more. I remember the French saying, no, we don't believe so. The Brits saying, no, they are not going there for terrorism purposes. They are there to help the fighters against Assad. It's to reinforce the opposition against Assad. Because they had the feeling that unlike we did in Tunisia or in Egypt, we were not supporting the Syrian opposition. So it took some time. In March, I came with a paper trying to analyze the phenomenon. They said, yeah, that's nice, but first we don't like your paper, but diagnostic is not interesting. What should we do? In June, I came with 24 propositions. They got the full support of the Council, and it became the template of a UN Security Council Resolution 2178. And last example of another function, raising difficult issue. That was probably my personal character, what I like most, trying to push a bit the system to have discussion on very sensitive issues. My first file when I started in 2008 or 9 was on Guantanamo. I had reached exactly the conclusion that President Obama had reached, that Guantanamo was a booster of radicalization. And that the so-called global war on terror paradigm that President Bush had developed after 9/11 was a disaster. It had led to CIA flights, CIA secret detention facilities, torture, Abu Ghraib, and Guantanamo. People were detained with no trial. So when Obama was elected, I took the first plane, I went to Washington, and I tried to meet the team around Obama. And I got the feeling that the first decision he would take when entering the Oval Office would be to decide to close Gitmo. And indeed, he entered the Oval Office. His first decision was to open Gitmo. But I had the feeling that he would then call our leaders one by one, asking us to take Gitmo detainees. He would call Angela Merkel and say, Angela, could you take 5 or 10? And she would have said yes, because Obama was smart, was nice, was well elected, and was close to Europe. He would have called Nicolas Sarkozy, he would say, Nicolas, could you take 5? And I said to myself, why don't we try for once to provide a collective response and tell Obama, okay, we will take 60 in Europe, but the price is that you will get rid of the global war on terror paradigm and move to a more European approach to terrorism, or to what the Americans were doing before 9/11, more respectful of the rule of law, human rights, and judicial approach. It took me 6 months, a very, very hard fight against the then Minister of Interior of Germany, Wolfgang Schäuble, who was completely against, to get a full support. We didn't take 60, around 25, which was quite something, because the Americans did not take one single Gitmo detainees on US soil. And Obama got rid of the global war on terror paradigm and moved to, he really changed completely the legal approach, except, and I'll come that a bit later, that he increased significantly drone strikes to, I think, an excessive extent. But that was quite challenging, because challenging a German Minister of Interior on that sort of question, it's not an easy job. I will explain later what I did on Salafism, which was another quite interesting, very difficult issue where I moved the line a bit, and it has, I think, changed really the way our member states now behave towards Saudi Arabia on that. So, one final point on the job that I've been doing, you have to know how far not to go, in a way. I was completely free to raise any issue, but sometimes you have to understand that if you go too far, you will get support. And if I remember, during these 14 years, there are only 2 files where I refrained to be too active. One was on drone strikes, by the way. I had drafted a very, very sophisticated paper on the legality of drone strike, and the conclusion was that the Americans were going too far. And I remember I submitted this paper to some colleagues in the capitals, and I got some phone calls saying, if I were you, I would not issue that paper, because that would be a major problem for the coalition. So I refrained to do that. And the second one, and I'll come to that a bit later, is Al-Hol. The prison, it's a refugee camp, but in fact a prison, where 60,000 women and children are located in northeast Syria. And that's a bit the legacy of the caliphate. It's those who were not killed at the last stage of our fight against Daesh in the Battle of Baghouz. And you have 30,000 Syrian, 30,000 Iraqi, and it's really one of the most dangerous places in the world. there were still a lot of European women and children, and my point was that in terms of security, our interest was to bring them back to Europe. But the French were completely against, and the French president was really against during his first term. In the second term, he has now decided to bring them back. And so I had understood on that, I pushed a lot humanitarian program to improve the situation in Al-Hol, but bringing that too much in the media would be counterproductive. I would have lost completely my principle. So that's what I want to say on the job. After 14 years, I don't say it's a false good idea. I find that even an interesting innovation in terms of governance. That's the only position which is like this. And I'm asking myself whether we should not do that for other subjects. And one that I have in mind is cybersecurity. I think I would see an EU cyber coordinator as an interesting innovation. Why? Because cybersecurity is a bit like counterterrorism 10 years ago. A lot of silos, even more silos, because you have a lot more in the hands of defense, a lot more involvement of the private sector, and we still fail to find a way to bring them all together. When I left the Council, I went to see the President of the European Council, the Belgian Michel, and my advice to him, he has not done that so far, was to probably transform my job into a European security advisor. During all these years, I was visiting the capital, and I was always meeting the national security advisor. You have a national security advisor at number 10, Downing Street. You have a national security advisor in the Élysée. And having close to the PEC, the President of the European Council, or close to the President of the Commission, someone who has this informal, constant contact with the national security advisor, who can be a lot more free, not in the system, but to collect information, to travel everywhere, as I was doing, sitting with the Sunni tribe in Fallujah in Iraq, or visiting Yemen and meeting everyone in the United States, I think would be a good idea. Lastly, it works if you can develop what a professor at the Kennedy School, IFETS, called informal authority. And that I find quite interesting. How do you achieve that in large organizations like the European Union and its huge bureaucracy, that they do what you would like them to do if you don't have direct authority, you cannot instruct them, and you don't have money to bribe them. And not to bribe them in a negative sense, but give them incentive. When a commissioner has a lot of money, he can try to convince people from doing something. Let me turn to my third, and I sense that I will have to speed up, my third point, which is 4 challenges which I think are still very important. The first one is creating an information sharing environment. You may have seen that after 9/11, the Americans set up a committee to look at what went wrong. And they quickly realized that they had all the information which could have prevented 9/11 from happening. If they had put together the data held by the CIA and the data held by the FBI, they would have prevented 9/11 from happening. And therefore, the first recommendation of the 9/11 Commission was the need to connect the dots. And as always, the Americans developed a very comprehensive policy to the extent that a soldier like Mr. or Mrs., I don't remember, Manning, soldier in Iraq, could download in a tent in Iraq the most secret cable from the State Department. It's crazy. It will never happen in Europe. But Americans decide that information has to be spread and shared as widely as possible. So Soldier Manning downloaded secret cables. That's how I discovered that every time I was talking to an American diplomat, he was making a report and was quoting extensively what I was saying. And it's all accessible on internet. Similarly, Edgar Snowden, working for a private company, getting access to the most secret information of the NSA. It's crazy. It's not possible here. And of course, he took a lot of secret information and went to Moscow. So the Americans went very far. Why? And it's so important to share data, as I've said. We're not in a Cold War paradigm. We have a common enemy, terrorist organization. And that was a similar problem in Europe for years. But it's no longer the problem. Every time there was a terrorist attack, I was always asked by journalists the same question. Are member states sharing enough information? For some years, my answer was yes. Was no. They don't share enough. But after a while, member states changed so much that they have decided, and they are now sharing 100% of the information which are relevant for the fight against terrorism. It is amazing. The problem is no longer sharing of data. The problem now is how do we collect the data in the first place? And the third pillar is how do we analyze all the data that we have collected and shared? And that's another challenge. So let me go through these three pillars, because they are all three pillars necessary if you want to create an information sharing environment. Collect data. It's probably the most challenging one. We need to collect more data, not because we want to be a big brother society, but because if you want to stop a terrorist plot, you need to have all the relevant data. But because of the privatization that we've had all these 2 decades, most of the data we need are held by the private sector. We need financial data, and that's why the Americans developed in secret a program called the TFTP, the Terrorist Financing Tracking Program. We need travel data. That's why the Americans developed the concept of access to PNR, passenger name record. Every time you buy a flight, you give to the company, to the airline company, a lot of information which are stored in a PNR, passenger name record, and it is quite interesting for the police. We need telecom data, the so-called metadata that I referred to earlier. We need internet data. We need probably other forms of data like battlefield information. When the French army enters into Mali, they collect data on the battlefield, but so far they were not sharing that data with the police or with justice. But it's very important to have that data. I remember when the Operation Serval occurred, the French intervened to stop the jihadi organization in Mali, to reach Bamako. They arrested they killed a lot, but they arrested 200 fighters. And they transferred these fighters to the Malian authorities. They all have been released. Why? Because the soldiers were not collecting the data. If you have a crime scene, the police is trained to collect the data on the crime scene. It's a job. But the military, it's not the job of the military, they have to fight. And so the big question, when we have worked a lot on that, is how do you make sure that you collect at least minimally data on the battlefield, and you share that data with the police. And you have to improve the quality of data, because with various forms of terrorism, we have a lot of problem with the alphanumerical data, because they have Arabic name, and when you translate that in our database, sometimes you don't identify the right person. So that's the need. But the problem is twofold. The first is the consequence of the digitalization of a world and the dominance of the Americans, the dominance of the Silicon Valley. Because in 85% of the time, you need digital evidence in an investigation, digital data. And the problem is, most of the time, they are stored in a cloud in the United States. And so far, if you want to get access to that data, you need to use the very lengthy and cumbersome procedure of what is called mutual legal assistance. You have to send a letter rogatory to the American Justice Department. It will take at least 1 year. And you have to abide by the Fourth Amendment to the US Constitution, which require what is called probable cause. And I don't have time to go into the explanation, but probable cause is a lot more demanding than what we have in Europe. In the United States, the Fourth Amendment is very protective. You have to tell the judge that you already know what is in the email. It's just to confirm what you already know. In Europe, the judge who wants to get access to the email is just to make a progress in the investigation. But if we have a 100% Belgian case, a would-be jihadist sending a mail in Belgium to a friend in Belgium to prepare an attack in Belgium, what is the link with the United States? There is no link except that the data is stored in the United States. So the system does not work. We need to find a way. The Americans found a way. We recently found a way to a new regulation on access to digital evidence so that we, as soon as it will enter into force, will be able to get directly access to the internet company and get directly the data without going to. And so the location of the data in Finland, in South America, or in the United States will be irrelevant. And the establishment of the company will be irrelevant. So that's a major breakthrough. So that's the first challenge. The second one is precisely the consequence of the Snowden leaks. Because the Snowden leaks have had several consequences. Because what do they show, the Snowden leaks? That the intelligence community in the United States is getting access to a lot of data. That we don't know if the internet companies have back doors or front doors, have agreement with the National Security Agency, but that raised a problem in terms of privacy and data protection in Europe. And so the two consequences of the Snowden leaks were the following. First, the internet companies start developing very sophisticated encryption device, what they call end-to-end encryption. In most of your apps, WhatsApp, it's all encrypted. And so it's not possible for anyone to enter into the system and get access to your message, to your emails, because it is encrypted. Why have they done that? Is because the internet companies of the Silicon Valley were extremely afraid to lose the European market, because they know that in Europe, we are fans of privacy and data protection. And to be honest, I was the first one when I saw the revelation of Snowden to look for alternative, like duckduck.com or whatever, alternative to Google, so that I'm not, my data are not, do not end up in a database at the NSA. And so they said the only way to keep the European market is to tell them that we encrypt the message, and therefore the intelligence service and the police will not get access to the substance of our database. You may remember a big fight between the CEO of Apple and the director of the FBI, because they had found somewhere in Boston after a terrorist attack an iPhone, and the director of the FBI wanted to get access to the content of the iPhone. And he turned to the CEO of Apple and said, "Could you give me the key?" The guy said, no way. Why did he do that? He could have helped discreetly. He did just because it was free advertising that iPhone are the most secure iPhone, mobile phone on the market. And why did the director of the FBI did that? Because he wanted to raise the issue in front of the US Congress so that they adopt a legislation to crack and force companies to crack the encryption system. So first problem, encryption. The second problem, it's what I call a data protection spring in Europe. All the players in Brussels, the Commission, the EDPS, European Data Protection, European Data Protection Supervisor, the European Parliament, and the Court of Justice, as from the Snowden revelation, start developing a very strict and demanding data protection policy. To the extent, don't quote me on that, I used to say it's no real religion. It's, in a way, defined as a value much above all the other values. And we don't have anymore a fair balance between other values. Security might be a value. It seems to reflect an expectation from the citizens that privacy and data protection as one of the most important value. I respect that, but it has very strange consequences. I don't have time to illustrate, but just two examples. There is currently in the European Parliament the discussion of a draft regulation prepared by the Commission to allow internet companies to scan their platform to identify child sexual abuse material, pedopornographic material, which is huge on internet. You would tend to say that makes sense to allow them to develop algorithms to detect sexual abuse material. No, the EDPS and most of the MEPs are against. They say, no, that you open the door to a big espionage, and that's what we want to avoid. Second example, it's a case law developed by the Court of Justice on data retention of metadata, what I described before. This legislation that we had adopted after the London bombings has been squashed by the Court of Justice, which decided that it was going too far by allowing the state to impose the retention of all the metadata on all the users, all the citizens, at all times for a period between 6 months to 2 years. And the court said, no, it's much too wide, it is disproportionate. You need to find a link between the data that you retain and the possibility of a crime. Then the Minister of Interior said, I'm sorry, but I don't know if the crime will happen in Leuven or in Brussels in advance. And the only way to develop that concept would be discriminatory. Would you retain only the metadata of the Muslim, the people with a Muslim name? Only the people living in Molenbeek? That does not fly. And so we've had several, I don't have time, but several cases of the Court of Justice, to the extent that at some stage the French government, it seems that Macron was not aware, the French government went to the French Conseil d'Etat and said, disregard the case law of the Court of Justice. Would have been a disaster at a time where we put pressure on Poland and Hungary on the rule of law. A founding country like France would disregard the supremacy of EU law, the case law of the Court of Justice, on such an important issue. And the court backtracked a bit because they realized that probably their ruling was a bit bizarre, was going too far, but still they keep the same line. Last example, a recent case, I was shocked, to be honest. I have an issue with an excellent teacher here, Professor Koen-Lennarts on that. It's a recent case where the court decided that the fifth money laundering directive, which imposed the creation of a register to identify what is called the beneficial owner of a company, and to put the name in the register and that this register be accessible to the public. And the court said, letting anyone getting access to this register to know that after this cascade of companies, it's a Russian oligarch, which has created a company in Luxembourg, which is owned by a company in Jersey, which is owned by a company in, I don't know, Panama. We want to know who is the beneficial owner. And that is a very important step, especially today, when we want to sanction oligarchs. The court said, no, that should remain confidential. Only financial intelligence unit or Ministry of Finance and, of course, the banks may have that information, but not the public at large. But most of the interesting investigations these days have been made by journalists. The Panama Papers, and many of these papers were discovered by journalists. I find that, well, privacy prevails. So there are a lot of discussion in Brussels. I would like the Commission to table a new directive on metadata retention. I would like the Commission to come with something on encryption. It's unlikely to happen. Even on child sexual abuse material, it does not fly. So it's quite difficult, but I can elaborate a bit more. So my first point, collect is getting more and more difficult than before because of this element. Share, I don't have time to go into the detail, but we've worked a lot on that. Europol is now the #1 hub for information sharing. Member states do share a lot with Europol, probably everything relevant for at least counterterrorism, but a lot for organized crime. We've modernized the database. We've created a lot of new database. So I won't go into the detail, but sharing is not an issue anymore. It works extremely well. What is a second challenge is the final step, the last pillar, after collecting and share, is analyze. Because in a way, we are collecting so much, we are sharing so much, that analysts are faced with a tsunami of data. The French have a word that I like, which is infobésité. We are fat with the number of... And so for analysts, it is quite challenging to make some sense of this tsunami of data, which means we need to use new tool, artificial intelligence. Europol got 500 million of data out of 2 major investigations. You may have heard the Encrochat investigation in Sky ECC. Again, I don't have time. If you want, I can develop. It's amazing what they discovered. The French gendarmerie, the Dutch maréchaussée, and the Belgian police managed to enter into a network of encrypted cell phones. And for Sky ECC is a Canadian company, and their advertising was, if someone managed to crack our system, we'll pay them 5 million euros. The Belgian police sent them a letter saying, please, we manage. What they discovered, they could follow in real time for months all the conversation, all the messages, all the pictures of the crooks all over the world. And it was unbelievable, unbelievable. Dirk Wouters is really painful. Could someone get rid of Dirk Wouters? Yeah, 5,000, 7,000, okay, 5,000, I give you the, well, more than that, 15,000. And then 3 days later, you had the pictures of Dirk with a bullet between the eyes. That's amazing. So they collected in different languages, so they need artificial intelligence to process all that data. We need to improve the training of analysts. I made the proposal to the French president when he was elected to create an Intel Academy to train the analysts, and that has been created. We need more diversity in the recruitment of the staff of the security service. If you take France, they were all police officers, but they all think alike. And so you need ethnologue, psychologists, you need people, data scientists, people who have different training, different skills, because issues are so complex, you need the different skill to make sense out of it. So that's my first challenge. I probably need to speed up. The second one is prevent. We have been working a lot on that. It's, of course, of prime importance. There is a lot more still needed on especially the detection of the tipping point. Let's say the French have identified 20,000 people at some stage of radicalization. Well, it's a challenge to identify them in the first place, but a lot more challenging is to determine when they will fall into violence, the tipping point. So that's difficult. Second, disengagement inside prison, disengagement outside prison. We are still working a lot on it. Internet as a major incubator of radicalization. Ideology as a driver, I will say a word on that. And new forms of extremism. On internet, I would have liked to have more time to explain what we have been doing, but I think we are going in the right direction with two legislation. One, the TCO, the Terrorist Content Online, which allow public authority to ask the internet companies to remove terrorist content within 1 hour, which is something, and the so-called DSA, DMA legislation, Digital Service Act, which is a very important piece of legislation because now we will be in a position to put a lot of obligation with financial sanctions on the companies if they don't have enough people for content moderation, We will have to audit algorithm, which is very important, and so on. So I dropped that part. I just want to say a word on the ideological aspect. If you turn to French experts in terms of radicalization, you have a very wide diversity of explanation. You may have heard of Gilles Kepel, who looked at the process of radicalization, and he believed that the religious dimension, at least for terrorism related to Daesh and Al-Qaeda, plays an important role. And he has his best enemy, who is professor at the Florence European Institute, Olivier Roy. He says religions has nothing to do. They're not radicalized because of Islam or Islamism or whatever. It's just they are nihilist. We have seen guys living for the sham and having the book Islam for the dummies. They don't know anything about Islam. A third one, François Burguin, says, no, it's not religious, it's not the nihilist generation, it's just geopolitics. It's because we have not been able to solve the situation of the Palestinian in Israel. We have too many American troops on Muslim soil. That's the problem. And last one, Farid Khosrow-Kavah said, no, it's socioeconomics. It's bad integration, racism, and that sort of marginalization, economic and social marginalization. My approach, as I said, having looked at many reports, has been a lot more pragmatic. I believe there is not a single driver. It may be different from one person to another, probably one country to another. And we will not succeed if we don't work on all the drives, each and every drive, including the religious driver. When I start raising that was terrible in Brussels. No one wants to follow me on that. Why? Because as soon as you say maybe one interpretation of Islam may have a problem, you look like Islamophobic. I was all but Islamophobic. When you talk to a lot of Muslims living in Belgium, they complain because one brand of Islam and the history of Islam, it's very rich. You have so many schools, so many interpretations, and now it has been completely monopolized and dominated by one brand, Wahhabism, Salafism. Why? Because after the Iranian Revolution, the Saudis, so afraid to lose the leadership in the Islam world, they start putting millions to promote their brand of Islam. And they send radical preachers all over the world. They built mosques everywhere. They printed and broadcasted and put on internet a lot of unacceptable content about the Jews, about the Christians, and so on. And therefore, if you're not Wahhabi Salafist, a bit Muslim broad somewhere, you don't have space. And so I tried to convince the system in Brussels, and believe me, that was terribly difficult. Julian King was completely of the opposite view, because in the UK, it's multiculturalism which prevailed. Well, and I finally managed to get the support of the 27 Ministers of Foreign Affairs, or 28, I don't remember, the Brits were still there. And I got a mandate to start negotiating with the Saudis how to reduce the problematic material. I'll come to that. But I failed on the internal side. On the internal side is how can we recreate a space with more diversity in the interpretation. If someone wants to be Salafist, be it. I don't mind, but I don't want this to be to occupy the whole religious space. Let other people think differently. And therefore, you have to encourage by creating faculty for Islamic studies, by having a sort of Erasmus between the scholars working on that, so that we create in Europe an intellectual capacity on Islam. On the external front, I went to Saudi Arabia with mandate of the council. I had a 1-hour meeting with the king of Saudi Arabia, and believe me, sitting next to the king and telling him that you have a problem with his Wahhabi interpretation, it's quite something. I had sitting next to me one of the most senior diplomats. He was really sweating. He said, we will never survive that experience. But strangely enough, the way I had put it convinced the king. He said, okay, let's start that exercise. And therefore, I have had 2 sessions, and my successor is continuing that, to try to identify all the material which is not acceptable. And I had next to me a Belgian guy who is a real expert on that, speak Arabic and understand Islam. And he could pinpoint, he said, look at this in your curriculum. It's hatred towards the Jews. It's hatred towards the Christian. You promote hatred and killings and so on. When faced with that, they say, no, we don't accept that. And we start that process. I find that interesting. Will it lead to something meaningful? I don't know, but that was a step. One word on, that's something interesting. I heard an interview of Francisca Bostin the other day after the investigation in the European Parliament. She refers to something which I too share, what she said, salad bar ideology. That we now have many new forms of extremism. In addition to the jihadism promoted in the last 15 years. First, we have a resurgence of right-wing violent extremism, which is problematic. Not everywhere, mostly in the Scandinavian country, in Germany, in the UK, a bit in France, in the United States. In the United States, these days, the Americans considered what they call REMV, racially, ethnically motivated violent extremism, more problematic than jihadi terrorism. And the phenomenon is more international, more interconnected. It's a pretty diverse movement. You have accelerationist, ultranationalist, neo-Nazi, skinheads, hooligans, neo-identitaire, eco-fascist, but they all share at least one common idea, that there is a white genocide. Renaud Camus, the French thinker, is about le grand remplacement. The white will be replaced by non-white people. And that's what reunified all these guys. That is one development. The second development is what I call during COVID, technophobia. We have seen people putting fire to G5 antenna. We have people destroying the offices of telecom companies because they hate all this development. And my point is, what if, but because we are entering a very strange world, difficult to talk to someone in a public service, you talk to a chatbot. Internet of Things, robotization, chatbot everywhere, CCTV, facial recognition, internet accessible everywhere. We now have a major constellation of satellite in low orbit and so on. And so if these people who feel that is a very, very hostile world we are entering in, and this aggregate with eco-fascists, people who believe that our government are zombies who have not understood the urgent need to change everything, anti-vax, as we've seen, far-left anarchist. I think we may see something like a sort of salad bar ideology, which could lead to some sort of violence. Now I will finish with two, it will be very telegraphic. My third challenge is what I call the disruptive tech. We have so far been lucky because the terrorism I was in charge of was low tech. People taking a knife in the kitchen, taking a car. But it might not be like this forever because we have here too a very quick development. Artificial intelligence, quantum computing, blockchain, synthetic bio, 5G, 3D printing, new material, virtual and augmented reality, the metaverse will be full of problems. Robotics, nanotechnologies, and weaponization of space. All this goes very quickly, sometimes in secret, like Elon Musk and his company Neuralink, which develop on monkey chips inserted in the brain, which will talk to the computer and so on. It's driven by the private sector, no longer by the Pentagon or by government. And that raises three challenges. The first one is our technological sovereignty. I was very surprised when the French decided to turn to an American company, Palantir, to develop their own software, because the French are the one pushing the most for European sovereignty. And Palantir is an amazing company in the United States. First, and we had a huge lobby by the CIA at the time to avoid that Huawei got the development of the 5G in Europe. And you may have seen the recent debate. I don't know if you have TikTok on your mobile phone, but none of the civil servants of the Commission are allowed to download TikTok anymore. So first problem, sovereignty. Second problem, ethical. Data protection and ethics. How can we have a more human-centered digital transformation? You may have followed, we are currently discussing a draft legislation on artificial intelligence to promote defined standards so that we try to avoid bias and discriminatory outcome of artificial. And the third one, that's where I want to go, which struck me a lot, the internal security in Europe is really lagging behind with all this development. I was surprised that very few people had assessed the threat that these new tech are creating. I have worked a lot on their potential, and probably more importantly, have thought of the transformative impact that all these tech have. In one word, assess the threat. AI amplifies existing threat. It's a lot more easy to use to do cyber attack with AI. We've seen Israeli geeks who managed to enter into the IT system of a hospital, and they change the outcome of lung X-ray. Someone who was in the final stage of a cancer, they remove all the dots on the X-ray. And someone who had nothing, they put a lot of dots. Imagine they do that in the hospital where the President of the United States has medical treatment. Create new threat, fake voice. Some people have made wire transfer based on the voice of a CEO, but that was a fake voice. Fake evidence. The day it will be possible to enter into the file of the investigative judge and alter the evidence by just using fake evidence. New vulnerability, like Internet of Things, connected cars, and the convergence of all these threats. I often use this example. What if you buy a drone, you use GPS, and you process a virus in a cloud lab? No, it's possible. Technically, don't ask me the detail, but it's possible to process a little Ebola in a cloud lab, and you spread that tomorrow at the final football match between Union Saint-Gilloise and Antwerp. There was an article in one of the first magazines of Al-Qaeda in Yemen, AQAM, whose title was How to Make a Bomb in Your Mom's Kitchen. What if and when the title will be How to Process a Virus in Your Mom's Kitchen? There we are in another ball game. So that's the threat. The second one is just maximize the potential of this new tech. Big data analytics, as I've said. Now Facebook is able to detect people who are about to commit suicide just by looking at the pictures they put on Instagram and the message they put on Facebook. Amazing. Well, we could do the same. Detection of weak signal, facial recognition, of course, robotics, drone surveillance. And finally, the third aspect we need to think is what I call the transformative effect. The banks have lost probably half of their workforce because of the development of AI. I don't know, Minister of Justice, the former Minister of Justice, will we lose half of the judges? Most of the big law firms are already using AI. One day, the Belgian justice will use a lot more AI. So we will always need a judge at the end of the process. But for simple case, car accident, by using the best AI, you can go through 100,000 cases similar to this one and find the best outcome. You will always have a human being at the end of the process. But the same border. When 14 years ago, border was happening at the border, you had a custom officer with a pet, looking at documents. No, borders is not that anymore. It does not happen at the border. It starts even before you buy your flight. Because before buying your flight, you will have to ask an authorization if you belong to a country, a visa waiver country. You will have to ask an ETIAS authorization, like when you want to go to the United States, as a Belgian, we are in a visa waiver program, we need an ESTA authorization. So you will, by computer, ask the authorization to enter into the Schengen zone. Then you buy your flight. You will give PNR data. Then you will go to the airport and you will give advanced information passenger data. And then you will enter into the Schengen and so on. So we had to rethink completely what border management means. But the same between the police and the intelligence community. Europol is supposed to do only law enforcement. But when they go into the dark web, when they use the artificial intelligence, they produce intelligence, not law enforcement information. So we have to rethink the respective role of the police and the law enforcement. So it has to be done. And that's why I pushed a lot the creation of an innovation hub where all the agencies, Europol, Eurojust, Frontex, CEPOL, and all work together to look at these three aspects, the threat, the potential, and the transformative effect. Finally, the external aspect. I will concentrate on the EU-US cooperation. I won't describe, there is a bit, the threat is less acute in Europe, but there is an Africanization of jihad, which I would have liked to describe. There is the legacy of the caliphate, Al-Ol and company, which I mentioned before. The role of Iran, no time to develop, but it's something important. Last point, something I did not push a lot, but I'm now involved in this process, is one tool in the counterterrorism toolbox that we have not tested enough is mediation. Would it make sense to talk to terrorists and try to bring them back to mainstream and convince them not to use violence? Probably with the core of Daesh and the core of Al-Qaeda, impossible. But there are many franchises and affiliated groups in Africa. For instance, ADF in East Congo or Shabab in North Mozambique. These are local groups with local grievances. They just pledge allegiance to Daesh or Al-Qaeda for convenience. And so if we talk to them and bring them, maybe we should do that more. But I turn to the EU-US city cooperation. It's a real true success story. I entered the Council of the European Union in 1995, exactly when our heads had agreed what was called the new Transatlantic Agenda, a much closer relationship with the Americans. And I remember the first meeting I had with the US Attorney General, Janet Reno. She was full of expectation. And she became very, very quickly disappointed because in 1995, 2 years after the entry into force of Maastricht, in the field of security, we were nowhere. Europol was not up and running. We had no agency. Eurojust didn't exist. We had nothing to offer. And when I see the development between in 25 years, it is really impressive. And now, I would say the cooperation with the Americans in security and especially counterterrorism is very intimate, and it's a very trusted relationship. I won't go into the achievement. We have concluded many agreements on extradition, on mutual legal assistance, on data exchange. Maybe data exchange, just to illustrate how intimate our relationship is. Now the US Treasury, the Ministry of Finance, share with Europol all the leads that have been identified by the Americans, and this is the CIA behind, through the TFTP program, the Terrorist Financing Tracking Program. And they share exactly in the same way with the intelligence community and with Europe. Second example, I pushed a lot the Americans to share with us all the data they have collected in the anti-Daesh coalition in a place called OGP, Operation Gallant Phoenix in Jordan, where they were collecting signal intelligence, collecting iPhone, interception, arrest people, interrogation, and so on. And they recently shared 27,000 data, names, alphanumerical, pictures, and that's shared with Europol, and Europol now is in the process of asking member states to insert all that into the Schengen information system. And the third example, probably more potentially interesting, now the DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, is sharing with Europol the name of the people who have been denied entry in the United States based on the ETIAS, the ESTA program for terrorism. So if, let's say, a Jordan or Saudi citizens is denied entry in the United States because they believe he is linked to terrorism, the name is from this year on shared with Europol, with the expectation, of course, that we too will, in exchange, share with the Americans all the people detect in our ETIAS program, which is exactly a similar one. But this relationship has not always been an easy one, has been sometimes a bit bumpy for the following reason, because on some aspect, we have constitutional difference and political difference. The first one is, I mentioned that before, I won't get back to that, was the global war on terror. That has led to a very difficult time. And for all the Bush years, I had a very difficult relationship, and we had a long discussion to try to convince the Bush administration to move back to the classical approach. The second most sensitive aspect is free speech. In the United States, the First Amendment protects all forms of speech, even the most ugly speech. It's not a coincidence if most of the neo-Nazi websites are hosted by American service providers. And it's something difficult to change because it's enshrined in the First Amendment. My opposite number used to say, you know, Gilles, the answer to bad speech is more speech. And in Europe even, we are divided on the scope of free speech. If I, like Jean-Marie Le Pen, the father of the current Le Pen, on TV in prime time, says in Denmark, Auschwitz is a detail of history. This is an invention of the Jewish lobby. If you say that in Denmark, no problem. If you say that in Brussels, you will end up in a criminal court, the Moreau legislation. And so even in Europe, we don't see the scope of free speech in the same way. That makes a bit different. But with the Americans, we have that problem. When the parliament adopted the TCO, the terrorist content online legislation, to remove within 1 hour the terrorist content, Americans were very upset. They said, you will curb free speech. Third problem, I mentioned that at length, data protection and privacy. That led the Court of Justice to squash many agreements with the United States. You may have heard of Schrems I, Schrems II. And these days, we are trying to finalize a new system, and we hope it won't lead to a Schrems III decision. Yesterday, the Data Protection EDPB, European Data Protection Board, issued a mixed opinion on what Biden and von der Leyen had agreed. And they will have to work again and adapt a bit what they had agreed. And for what I would call strategic autonomy. There are many voices in Europe, especially French, more led by the French, and you have on the other side the Dutch, the Swedes, those who are a lot more open in this term, to develop our own tech, and especially when it comes to security. One example, the Agency for Cybersecurity, which is called a European agency called ENISA, has made a proposal to create an EU cybersecurity certification scheme for cloud companies. The idea is that if you want to get the best certification, the data will have to be stored in Europe, The maintenance will have to be done in Europe, and so forth. Which, of course, for Amazon, for Google, and for Microsoft is not, in a way, a good news. That creates sometimes some tension in the relationship. So I reach, at last, my conclusions. I was very often asked, are we winning this battle against terrorism? In a way, difficult to answer that question. I say if you define risk as a combination of threat and vulnerability, so an equation with two terms. In terms of threat, the answer is no, I'm afraid. On the day after 9/11, we were faced with one organization, Al-Qaeda. And this organization has several hundred fighters. 20 years later, we have at least two organizations with a lot of franchises, affiliated groups, a bit everywhere in the world, and probably each has 35,000 fighters. So in terms of threat, no. In terms of vulnerability, that's completely different. Because of everything we have done these last 15 years, we have reduced our vulnerabilities significantly. The police, the intelligence community, they work together a lot better than before. We have very sophisticated legislation. We have a lot of new tools and so on. And therefore, in the balance, threat and vulnerability, I think in Europe we're okay. In some other places, I'm now chairman of an NGO working in Benin. I will be in Benin next week. Unfortunately, we see the jihadi group coming from Burkina Faso, from Niger, entering the country. We have now people pushed from Togo, pushed to Benin, refugees because of terrorist group, is not getting better there, unfortunately. Voilà, I've been much too long, and I'm more than happy to answer any question.
Thank you so much, Gilles. Thank you on behalf of all of us for what I found myself a very enthusiastic, powerful, very powerful and insightful presentation. And you spoke from your extraordinary personal experience of the fascinating job, and you covered a very wide range of subjects of interest to our audience today. So I suggest we indeed see what questions will be addressed to you. May I remind you, dear friends, the simple rules of Q&A. So if you want an answer, please ask a question. If you want to be recognized, identify yourself. And when I see that several students or invited guests ask questions, I will try to group them. So I have also to keep an eye on the clock, I know. For your convenience, there are two, I understand, mobile and I hope still sanitized micros. Who is going first? Who is going first with his or her question? So I recognize you, please. So here, Sylvia, can you please pass the mic? And then the gentleman 3 rows behind. Okay.
Hello,
please.
first of all. As I understand from your lecture, your job is a lot of balancing between like intelligence agencies, balancing between EU and the US maybe. And I also understand that it's a job of balancing between human rights and the protection, and on the other side, the need for security, basically. So in your opinion and in your experience, what is the biggest danger for human rights when it comes to counterterrorism policy? Is it maybe the definition of terrorism is getting too wide and it includes a lot of steps before the actual act of terrorism? What is, in your opinion, like the biggest danger that we're facing when it comes to human rights?
Gilles, I suggest we take immediately the question of the gentleman. So, the first question was human rights and terrorism mainly. Yes.
So thank you for your very interesting lecture, a very personal outlook behind the doors of the European work against terrorism. So I was wondering about the transatlantic dimension, because you've mentioned a lot of coordination in the fields of data sharing, information sharing. But one of the big points I think we in the US still diverge or still react in different ways is the external reaction to terrorism, where we see, you mentioned mediation as a possible option to be explored. Other ways of tackling the roots of terrorism debate, where we see the US undertaking bold operations in the killing of Qasem Soleimani, the killing of al-Baghdadi and his successor. So my question would be whether you see any way forward in that field of external reaction to terrorism.
Okay. Okay, I suggest we take them and then we go to a second round.
These are excellent questions. First, on human rights, what helped me a bit is that I, before being EU CTC, have been Deputy Secretary of the Convention who drafted the Charter of Fundamental Rights. And in a way, I spent a year of my life to do this because I find that very important. That first very challenging experience, because you start with a blank paper and you have to draft the Bill of Rights. And that was a successful enterprise. And so, in a way, I could, because people try to see me only through the security lens. And I started by fighting against Guantanamo, which was not a security fight, but a human rights fight. And I tried to, like Obama put it very eloquently in many speeches, to tell that any violation of human rights is a major ingredient of radicalization. And therefore, we had to have a very strict human rights-based, rule of law-based judicial approach to terrorism, and not just killing people. Like the Americans have what they call signature strike when they use a drone. And signature strike is that the drone will kill someone not because we know it's Gilles de Kerchove, but he looks like Gilles de Kerchove. So a tall guy walking in the mountains in Afghanistan with a long beard and 2 meters high, looked like Ben Laden. Poof! Oh, I'm sorry, it's not Ben Laden. It's a guy who wanted to see his kids. And so, for me, that was very important, and especially in the Arab countries I was visiting. When you talk to the head of the Egyptian intelligence service, the guy is not a nice guy. Yeah? He has a lot of, all the guys, the Muslim brothers are terrorists. All the Muslim brothers. Yeah, they became, after a stay in prison and tortured and so on, believe me, they will effectively become terrorists. So I don't like a lot the idea of the balance. A human rights expert would tell you that it's not a balance. You don't have to balance. It's like data protection. An expert on data protection will tell you the starting point is we don't collect data. Zero. And if you want to start collecting data, you have to tell me why, for what purpose, and that it be extremely minimal, proportionate, and so on, very necessary, and through a legislation. So my concern is not much in Europe on human rights, is on trust, except my concern on data protection, which is the real one. I think we are going too far. The Committee of the European Parliament dealing with security is called the Libe Committee. These people have only liberté, freedom in mind, and are not interested in security. And one of my proposals, I've tried to push for that, is to create a security committee in the European Parliament, so that the head of the security service in closed door session could come and tell the MEP what is the nature of what they do, exactly how they work, and what is the nature of the threat. But that requires that they get a clearance, and MEP don't like to be have to be vetted and get top secret clearance because they believe that being elected is enough. And so there is a problem. In all the strong democracy, in the UK, for instance, you have the security service and the intelligence service going to a special committee and telling 100% of what they know, and it keeps secret, and it's not leaked. And until we have that, it's very difficult to explain why you need a PNR. If you want to tell all the detail how to use PNR, you lose the efficiency of the tool. I remember when Snowden revealed the way the Americans were working, my American counterpart told me that they saw a change in the behavior of the jihadi organization because they knew how the other side was working. So there I have a concern, but my second concern is a different one. I've been working 26 years to develop an area of freedom, security, and justice, which one of the objectives of the European Union. And the real key moment was at a special and first meeting of the European Council on the subject, which took place in 1999 in Finland, in Tampere. And I was the one drafting the conclusions. And I put something very important, that from that day on, judicial cooperation in Europe would be based on mutual recognition. And mutual recognition of judicial decision. And that's the European arrest warrant is the perfect example of that. When I was chief of staff of a Belgian Minister of Justice, the government decided not to extradite two terrorists, one to Spain and one to the UK. The terrorists to Spain, these were a couple of Basque citizens, Garcia Moreno, or Moreno Garcia, I don't remember, because our Minister of Justice thought that the Spaniards were torturing in the prison in Spain the members of the ETA. And so the government said, no, this is a political fight, we cannot extradite the Garcia Moreno to Spain. I was very shocked. And the same with Father Ryan, who was member of the IRA, who was captured in Belgium, and the government decided not to extradite him to the UK. Yeah, but the UK and Spain are members of the European Union. It's a political project. To refuse extradition to promote human rights, that's not the way to proceed. And that's why I pushed so far, so much after 9/11 to get the European arrest warrant. But you can only do that if people have a huge trust in each other, if there is full confidence. And the problem is, with no enlargement and to country where sometimes you have corruption in the judiciary and so on, some judges do not trust anymore. And for instance, the Article 7 procedure against Poland and Hungary, that has a major impact on the speed of integration in this field in Europe, because people will not accept that a competent authority in Hungary, prompted by the leadership, would like to get an email to a direct access to an internet companies for political reason and not for the fight against terrorism, or would try to shut a website for political reason because that's an opposition website or whatever. And we see more and more that it's no longer possible to adopt legislation like the European arrest warrant anymore. We have to add safeguard after safeguard after safeguard and make it a lot more complicated like it was before Tampere. So that's my concern is more on trust and on maybe we go too far on data protection. On human rights in Europe, I don't have much concern. My concern is outside Europe. That is true. And that leads me to your question. I think the Americans, as I said, they have used, and hopefully they have kinetic response that sometimes Europe is not able to show. We need that. For instance, you cannot fight Daesh with judges and law enforcement officers. You need to mobilize military means. And that's why we create the anti-Daesh coalition with a military response, and I'm very much in favor. and the Americans are a lot more sophisticated in their approach. My opposite number, the State Department, promotes what they call CVE, counterviolent extremism. They do a lot in development assistance. So I think we're not that far from each other. It's just that we don't have, until recently, for some time still, we don't have the same kinetic means to project military means. But for the rest, we really are very close to each other, except at the margin on issues like free speech. Data protection is an issue for the rest.
Yeah, maybe can I just, I don't want to prevent the next question of the second round, but based on my experience in the United States and a bit in Europe, is that it's a lot about trust, as you were saying, in this cooperation. And for example, if the Americans are asking to take prisoners to Europe, you also mentioned the foreign fighters. It's a normal reaction from member states in the European Union that they ask the Americans then to share the legal file that they have and information that they have. And sometimes this legal file will be solid. Sometimes, and I've seen some of them, there may be less information available that we would need in order to prosecute in Europe in our systems. Now, speaking of which, and this would be my question I would add on before going to the next round, is this trust question. If the one member state to another member state, or the Americans to the European member state, they share pertinent information on a person that may be suspected of. Have we already reached the stage that member states in Europe and their prosecution systems, that they feel, of course, they will appreciate the information, but is there a kind of obligation, even a moral obligation, to do something with that information to prosecute? Have you already reached that step? So I give you information which may be pertinent in order to prevent something, or maybe a person that escaped your own information system. Is the national system that receives that information obliged, legally obliged or morally obliged to prosecute, which would add to the trust, of course, that them. But
I don't know. But I mentioned the 27 data names and so on that Americans shared. Europol is in the process of cleaning, because sometimes the Americans collect too widely, and so there were some people dead in the list, and the Americans didn't know it, so they had a database with dead people. And so there is an exercise ongoing by which Europol and the member states are trying to clean up the list. And when they believe that it's worth inserting in the EU database, they will turn to the member state and ask them to insert that in the SIS. I think there is a lot more that we think in terms of fluid, informal exchange of intelligence. The Belgians have been pretty good in this investigation on corruption by Qatar and Morocco in the European Parliament, but then information came from a third state in the first place. Could be the Americans, I don't know. I'm not in... No.
But I think there was a... Yes, sorry. Okay, let's take two more questions there. Yeah, and then you...
Yeah.
Please.
So I think it's also a very interesting approach when you think about the competences of this European security. My question would be more on an external level, the capacity that this EU counter-terrorist policy or the measures, I mean, you on one hand, you also mentioned mutual recognition, which is also an interesting approach, but also Bin Laden, for example, you mentioned it also. I mean, what's the capacity of this EU counter-terrorist policy or program that you can really go and say, yeah, I'm going to another country and maybe even breaching sovereignty of that country, maybe because we're standing here for a greater good, or Also, it's a bit similar when you say data protection or freedom of speech, but taking it even further when you're breaching sovereignty and going to another country and killing somebody maybe behind in terms of a greater good, or what's the capacity of this program externally?
Yeah, thank you. And then maybe you have two questions.
So you mentioned really briefly about the foreign fighters that are still in Syria, in prisons, and women and children, I think. And you also talk about France not wanting to them coming back to Europe. So I'm writing my thesis about reintegration of foreign fighters in Europe, and my question is regarding a reintegration policy, if there's a reintegration policy common in the EU, because I know that there are plenty of policies regarding prosecution of foreign fighters that are coming back from the ISIS territories, but I haven't found many information about reintegration and rehabilitation policies for them. So, yeah, my question is that if there's something common in this regard, or if it's something that the member states should take care of themselves.
Okay.
Thank you.
On this, I'm not an expert, but the radicalization aware network, the RAN, has subgroups. Some are dealing on that, and so they produce a lot of report, which are, I suppose, accessible. I know, for instance, on kids, the French have a very sophisticated system to handle traumas, the way they handle the return of the children from the first day on, and it's very impressive with psychologists, psychiatrists, and that's very well done. But honestly, we're not advanced enough. That's what I said before. I think we need to work a lot more on that. Many of our member states made a lot of mistakes on the rehabilitation, reintegration process. But that should not prevent us from trying. Sometimes the people returning are even lying. I remember the French prosecutor of Paris saying many women get back to Europe and say, "Oh, I made a big mistake. I was seduced by a man, and I didn't want really. I didn't mean that, all that." And when you tap their conversation, they are still pretty radicalized. So it's we have to be extremely cautious on that. But I would turn to the RAN to look at. I don't know what Belgium has developed because I suppose the complexity of our country is even adding an additional layer of problem with the communities in charge, justice being in charge of part, the community in charge. But there is a Belgian guy who is director of the ICCT in the Netherlands, who passed his PhD thesis on that. If you want, at the break, I can give you the detail on that. On sovereignty, I personally think that EU should be more assertive on two aspects, on corruption and on human rights. In many of our agreements, we have a human rights clause and the possibility to link our assistance to respect for human rights. We nearly never suspend our assistance. I think one of the major problems of notably African countries is the level of corruption. If I had a say in all this, I would say I would have a difficult conversation with the government and say, my assistance will be linked to the efforts you will really show. And I would say you have to improve your Transparency International ranking. Otherwise, we will not get it. The response of the people dealing with development assistance is, yeah, but the first to suffer from that sort of policy will be the local people, the population, and the elite will always have their bank account in Switzerland and their apartment in the 16th neighborhood of Paris. But that's, for me, at the core of the problem. But what was a challenge for me was talking to a country like Egypt, where you know that they really violate human rights. A strange experience that I did was that because I was seen as a security guy, they, in Saudi Arabia, for instance, were listening to me a lot more than my counterpart, who was the special representative for human rights. For many years, the only foreign policy of the European Union towards Saudi Arabia was death penalty. I respect that, but impact zero. They were not even listening to us. I remember, because I had this trusted relationship with the Saudis, and I don't like the guy I was talking to. He's probably the guy who murdered Khashoggi. Not the point. But diplomacy is to talk to sometimes people you don't like. I remember that during a night, I insisted that what they had done was stupid. They had put 4 women in jail, and they were prosecuted on the basis of the counterterrorism legislation, because they were pushing for a change in the policy to allow women to drive. And strangely enough, MBS, the day he authorized women to drive, he put 4 women in prison who was asking for that. Because he has always to balance an opening of the society with trying to reassure the most conservative part of his kingdom. And so I told them, I said, nobody in the world believes these are terrorists. It's counter-effective. It's stupid. Then the guy called MBS, and the day after, they were no longer prosecuted on terrorist ground. And I said to myself, that's because they listened to me, because they believe this guy is a strong guy, because he's the UCTC. If I had been the human rights special representative, they would not have even listened. And so that's a bit a paradox. But how to behave with countries with a huge bad track record in terms of human rights, that's a big question. In terms of information, we have the theory of the the poison tree, that you can not use the fruit of the poison tree. So if a country which used torture to get an information is sharing that information with you, there is a legal problem to use it in investigation. But I'm not sure that all our countries are doing that.
Well, thank you so much. I think we will have to let you go to lunch, and but not before giving another round of applause and to the. And Gilles, as a token of appreciation, we will also leave you with a small gift, and I hope we found your only weak spot. Okay. Okay. Voilà. Oh.